I'm Jake Duritsky, Vice President of Strategy and Research at Team NEO, and here to share with you for the next 10 or 15 minutes a bit more in depth about the Misaligned Opportunities report for 2021. Misaligned Opportunities has become an extremely important tool as we try to inform and influence the way we think about in-demand talent gaps in Northeast Ohio and how critical diversity, equity, and inclusion are to closing that gap over time. We won't be able to grow our way out of this problem. We've said it before. We have a demographic headwind issue that we're going to face, and we need to deal with it. We have a slightly declining population. We have a slightly aging workforce, and we're not replacing people at the rate that we need to continue to fill jobs in the region. Without stronger efforts around diversity, equity, and inclusion, we won't be able to close these gaps over time. I'd like to reiterate what Bill said and thank our sponsors, particularly Delta Dental, who has helped push our own thinking on this issue as we've evolved the way we've thought about this and the impact the pandemic has had on these issues. One of the things we like to start with is a foundational level setting, the way we think about data that existed even before the pandemic. A lot of this data you'll see is from 2019. So foundationally, there were structural issues in the Northeast Ohio economy, frankly, in the US economy, that existed long before the pandemic started to accelerate those. When you think about things like percent of population, when you think about things like percent of total employment, communities of color, particularly in Northeast Ohio, African Americans and Hispanics, make up anywhere from 20 to 25% of our base of workers, of our base of residents, an extremely important population. But what we've seen over time is that whether it's through the lens of median household income, whether it's through the lens of educational attainment, particularly as it relates to bachelor's plus attainment, bachelor's postgraduate degrees, or as it relates to the most in-demand jobs in the economy, there is a disproportionate lack of representation from communities of color in Northeast Ohio. To my earlier point, we cannot close the gap if that persists. But one of the things that we recognized throughout the pandemic is that the pandemic has accelerated some of these trends. Black unemployment was impacted twice as much as white unemployment was during the COVID crisis. At its peak, unemployment rates for African Americans exceeded 14%. In some sectors, like parts of the service economy where there's disproportionate representation, it exceeded 20%. 1 in 5 workers in communities of color were laid off due to the impact of the pandemic in certain sectors of the economy. We absolutely have to do better. But what we know is right now we're not. And we're not doing better from a job demand perspective and from a credentialing perspective. The foundation of aligning opportunities looks at 3 in-demand sectors of the economy: manufacturing, healthcare, and IT and tech talent. And what we found over the course of the research in the past 5 years, and now in the second year of Misaligned Opportunities, is that there is significant underrepresentation in the most in-demand credentialed areas of the economy. If you look at an area like manufacturing, for instance, you'll see that African Americans, though they represent 12 to 15% of the regional population, make up only 6 to 7% of manufacturing credentials. In IT, it's similar. Healthcare is slightly higher, but still significantly underrepresented. And when you dig into the data, what you see is that it's not just an underrepresentation in credentialing, it's an underrepresentation in the most in-demand areas of the economy overall. For instance, registered nursing. African Americans comprise less than 5% of total registered nursing credentialings in Northeast Ohio last year. The challenge with that is that we cannot continue not to fill holes like registered nursing, which are the most critical in-demand occupations we see in Northeast Ohio. We have to do better. But overall, when you look at where in-demand opportunities exist in the marketplace, what you see is that for Hispanics and African Americans, only 10% of credentials are going to that key demographic here in Northeast Ohio. When you start to look at occupations specifically and start to look at the top 20 occupations that we see in Northeast Ohio, those are occupations that pay a family sustaining wage, that have strong growth prospects, that will see a lack of automation over the next 10 to 20 years. So significant opportunity. When you look at those top 20 occupations, what you see is that only one of those top 20 occupations have proportionate representation to our communities of color here in Northeast Ohio. And the stark reality, and something that we did different this year, is when you start to look at those occupations specifically represented by minority communities, you start to see that it tends to fall on those that were impacted most by the pandemic and those that don't necessarily offer a future trajectory toward growth and opportunity for Northeast Ohio that we need to see. Service sector jobs, hospitality jobs, leisure jobs, restaurants, bars, barber shops. We are not seeing the representation that we need to fill the in-demand gaps that we have in the economy, particularly as it relates to manufacturing, healthcare, and IT. We had a gap in those three sectors alone of 55,000 jobs going unfilled last year. Again, we have to do better if we're going to fill those jobs. When we think about business ownership in Northeast Ohio, unfortunately, it's a very similar trend. Recent data from the census shows that only 6% of businesses were owned by minorities in 2017. If you look at the breakout of that, African Americans represented 1.5%. Hispanics represented less than 1% in the economy. A key component to this is not just the talent that we need, not just the credentials that we need, but about empowering people to have opportunities here to start businesses for a thriving economy. Bill talked about this idea of a vibrant economy. It's something that we point out a lot. We need to be talented, but we can't be talented if we don't have a base of equity here in the region, which is going to be so key in closing the talent gap over time. If we have that talent and equity equation figured out, it will lead to more innovation. It will lead to more business investment. And hopefully over time, it will lead to more resiliency, better sites, better infrastructure, broadband access for all. The reality is those are all integrated together. You can't think about those individually. If we're not doing one, we're not doing all of them. And if we want to think about long-term outcomes for the economy, if we want to think about how we're more competitive over time, if we want to think about how that competitiveness translates into prosperity, better incomes, better housing values, better educational attainment, we have to think, about the interdependency of all of those variables and all those factors. I would like to point out that the data can be overwhelming. There are elements of this that, even as we look back at it, continue to reinforce some of the structural issues we face as a community and the structural issues we need to overcome to do better as an economy. But we don't just want to make this about the negative. There are organizations, there are companies, there are initiatives taking place in Northeast Ohio that are starting to address this and starting to address it in a really meaningful way. I listed the 8 here that we worked with for this version of the report. College Now and the Lumina Foundation, the Greater Akron Chamber of Commerce in Connexus, Northeast Ohio, the Greater Cleveland Partnership, the Fund for Our Economic Future, the NFL Hall of Fame in Canton, Lorain County Community College, Ohio to Work, and Youngstown State and IBM's relationship around tech credentialing. These are all different initiatives, institutions, efforts to help drive change. So I would encourage this group, as you have an opportunity to download the report and to take a deeper look at this, there are people making innovative changes to the ways they think about addressing this issue around DEI in the community. And this is just a sample of some folks who are doing that and doing it really well. So key takeaways before we get to our question and answer segment. One, misalignment continues to be a key issue in how we address the gap in talent over time in Northeast Ohio. We've done some research which showed that if we fix this DEI issue just through proportionate representation of the population that we have here, we could close that in-demand talent gap by up to 1/3. That's incredibly powerful in an economy like Northeast Ohio. The reality is, much like we saw in lost opportunities for women, the pandemic has accelerated these trends and unfortunately accelerated them in a negative way. We don't yet fully understand the impact of what the pandemic did, nor will we for several years. The reality is, though, based on all the evidence we've seen to date, it's had a tremendously disproportionate impact on DEI-related issues in our community. Incremental progress is being made in some areas of the economy, but not in a way that we need it to drive structural change. We have to do better and have to do better in growing the numbers of graduates and the in-demand credentialing that we have here in Northeast Ohio if we want to see these issues start to go away. And to my last point in the last slide, regional businesses and stakeholders who are having the most success are proactively taking these issues on. They're dealing with these effectively by being creative in how they think about these issues, by being creative in how they think about the wraparound services that are necessary to address these issues, and by thinking fundamentally differently about issues of DEI related to the community in Northeast Ohio. I appreciate the time this morning. These are never what I would call results that one loves to share, but I think the results that the community needs to hear. And with that, we will pause here for a question and answer before we push it off to our panel.
Thanks, Jacob. One of the questions that we got in mentions, can you talk a little bit more about how work in diversity, equity, and inclusion would help move the gap in demand jobs moving forward?
Yeah, great question. So I just touched on the fact that we could potentially close the gap by about a third if we just focused on greater DEI related issues. The reality is, as I mentioned to start, we aren't growing our way out of this. We need to find ways for people here in the community to connect to opportunities. When you look at labor force participation rates, for instance, in some of our most distressed neighborhoods, urban and rural in some cases, you see participation rates that are often 5 to 10% lower than the country as a whole. That means for whatever reason, people aren't working, people aren't seeking work. That's an opportunity for us as a community to think strategically about alignment, to think strategically about how we hire, how we think about hiring, and that set of issues we need to deal with as a community to make it easier for people to have opportunity for jobs here in the community.
Thanks, Jacob. What do companies need to ask themselves internally when they are working towards those DE&I initiatives?
Yeah, that's in some ways a tough question to answer, right? I think every company is on a different journey in their own process of how they think about these issues. What I would say is that key stakeholders who work with us, board members, members of our councils, have figured out new creative solutions and ways to address these issues by thinking differently about their own practices. That can be things like flexible work environments. Certainly one of the things we've seen through the pandemic is offering different work hours, different ways to think about flexible scheduling has been critical in helping to keep workers. We've had other companies, particularly in the tech space, tell us that by making different geographic investments, by thinking differently about public transit access, they've significantly increased their pool of minority applicants just based on physically where they're located. Other companies are now thinking differently about work from home policies, about what needs to actually take place, particularly on the plant floor, for instance, versus what can take place remotely. And then you deal with the wraparound service issue, things like childcare, for instance, companies offering a flexible work environment, times when you can even bring your kids to work. I'll be honest with you, you can't see her, but just off screen, my 7-year-old daughter is here with me today. I'd have trouble doing this in this environment if I couldn't have had that flexibility myself. I think culturally for companies, thinking about all these issues and starting to understand best practices is going to be absolutely critical to addressing these. And I would say one thing we're trying to do is to take this conversation to the next level. For our Aligning Opportunities report, which is coming out in November, we are trying to focus more on the cultural issue. It's not just about identifying the gap. It's about starting to understand the challenges and solutions more holistically to how companies are addressing some of these issues. So I would encourage folks that are listening today, if you have your own creative practices to how you're addressing this, please do reach out and be a part of that discussion as we push that forward.
Thanks, Jacob. We have a data-specific question. Some of the opportunities are unattainable because there is a lack of educational preparation. Does our data recognize this?
Yes, and that's a complex question. So yes, there are iterative skills that are necessary for a lot of these. You think about math, for instance, as a prerequisite. If you fall behind in the 3rd or 4th or 5th grade, it's very hard to catch up, and you're playing catch up for a really long time. It requires prerequisites. It requires a lot more upskilling over time to get that person or that individual to where they need to be. I think a part of why and how we've acknowledged that is through our own emerging talent work. What we've recognized is that dealing with these issues can't just start once you're an adult. It can't just start once you hit 18 and something magically happens. We need to focus more on 6th through 12th graders, on their parents, on educators, administrators, in trying to deal with these issues and solve them over time. It has to start earlier, and to the question, we have to start thinking about those critical and fundamental skills that are at the core of this and and how more people have access to those in the best possible way. One other that I would point out is something that we saw through the pandemic, which was a lack of equal access to broadband. Broadband access in Northeast Ohio, there are some communities that have less than 80% access to broadband overall. What we're doing today digitally in this environment and talking through these issues is allowing us to do that. If you don't even have a connection to the internet, it's going to be extremely hard to compete in a post-pandemic economy, and only going to get harder as we go forward.
How does this data or equity data for our region in general compare against other regions in the US that we compete against regularly for business growth?
It's a great question. So it's a mixed bag, to be honest. If we think about levels of educational attainment, for instance, one of the things we see, particularly among communities of color, is that we tend to have a much lower bachelor's plus rate. We don't see the level of educational attainment from a bachelor's or a graduate degree perspective that some of the other markets that we compete against do. What we do see is a much higher rate of folks with some college. So one of the things we can infer from that is that there are people in Northeast Ohio who are starting down a pathway, but for whatever reason, not finishing, stopping out because life gets in the way, because of the issues and those wraparound services that they can't deal with. I'll plug one of the case studies that we have in here. College Now, Cleveland State, the Lumina Foundation, and luckily us, were able to participate in some really interesting research with Cleveland State that looked at African-American adult learners, those that were 25 and older, and why they stopped out. And there are a set of issues that are extremely critical, but we can deal with if we decide to come together and deal with them as a community. It's research like that that will start to move the dial over time. But to the core point of the question, we're a mixed bag as it relates to other metros. The reality is we don't want to be a mixed bag. We want to be a high performer. We want to address these structurally in a way that gives us a competitive advantage in, how we think about dealing with issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion over time.
We have two more questions.
Okay.
Is there any sign of improvement of minorities entering credentialing programs in the high demand areas? Which community programs seem to work best to achieve this?
Yeah, so there is some incremental improvement. So for tech and IT, for instance, we did see some improvement this year. It's hard to say if year over year that makes a trend though, right? We'll have to pay attention to that over time and see what the true impact of the pandemic was. What I would say, there have been emerging programs, things like Ohio to Work, which was a Jobs Ohio sponsored program that was piloted in Cuyahoga County, which is thinking differently about training, bringing in groups like Goodwill of Northeast Ohio, the Urban League of Greater Cleveland, Ohio Means Jobs, and structurally starting to think differently about training, about how you think about skills and assessing those skills, and about fundamentally how you think about training people up for the jobs of the future. One of those is through things like coding boot camps, for instance. So in this endeavor, Tech Elevator was a partner in that. I think having a broader set of stakeholders collectively together, having that conversation can only benefit the community by seeing different perspectives from each of our own.
And our last question, as one of the top challenges in Northeast Ohio is high demand graduates leaving our market. What's being done to retain college graduates?
Yeah, another good question. We do know that we keep, on average, less than 50% of students here in Northeast Ohio. That varies by college or institution. But across the board, we keep around 47% of students here. One of the things that's been really encouraging is seeing partners, in this case, particularly in Greater Cleveland, that have come together recently. Destination Cleveland, for instance, the Greater Cleveland Partnership, Engage Cleveland, the Cleveland Leadership Center, Global Cleveland, and others who are starting to think strategically about what do we have to do to both keep people here, but also sell new residents on it. And a part of that means making sure everyone feels welcome, making sure everyone has an opportunity. The reality of the data hasn't changed over time. People move for a couple of reasons specifically. Sometimes it's because they want to experience a new market, but many times it's because of a new job or family. Being the most welcoming community we can be for everyone and finding opportunity for everyone, I think over time is going to give us that competitive advantage that we need. Thank you for the thoughtful questions and for spending 20 minutes with us here this morning. I appreciate the time and appreciate you taking the time to talk through these critical issues with us.